So I wanted to welcome all of you to the third of the series in our new possible the post-pandemic city series. And of course, as all of you know, we are really lucky to have some extraordinary faculty who are also great researchers and practitioners. And so this new possible series looks at what their expertise or interests are and weaving it back to theory and practice in the real world. So we are really, really delighted that all of you could join us and connect on such an important topic, because this topic really is one that is affecting every single aspect of our lives. And if you would have asked me last year, pandemics, what is that? And I would have thought of some Spanish influenza and the like, but never really connected it with my day-to-day life. So with that in mind, we need to understand that also this whole idea, this whole impact of pandemics is not just at an individual level, but it is really at a global scale, and each piece affects the other. So with that, Dr. Jim O'Connell and Dr. William Koehler, who are the speakers today, got together and decided to put their interests and expertise together to create this new course called the Globalization, Planning and Pandemics. And today you'll just get a little glimpse into what they are going to teach throughout the semester, and so much more connections of how all these three pieces work. I just want to, before I get started, and you can always look up their CVs online. I think Andrea is already sending those out by chat. But I wanted to give a brief introduction to Dr. Jim O'Connell and Dr. William Koehler, both of whom are extraordinary teachers, scholars, thinkers, as well as believe very much that real world practice is connected with all things we do in academia. Dr. Connell has worked as a community planner at the Boston office at the National Park Service, where he specializes in planning for historic sites and heritage areas. And that's what his PhD from the University of Chicago was focused on. Jim is also the author of 7 books. Can you believe that? Apart from doing all this, and many, many articles on planning, on New England history and beyond. And just recently, one of his books, The Hub's Metropolis, which was published by the MIT Press, as well as Dining Out in Boston, A Culinary History, show you the incredible breadth and interest that Dr. Connell brings to the table. I'm not going to take a lot of time because his CV is the testimony of some extraordinary work that he has done, but we are really fortunate to have such a scholar and dedicated teacher in our program, and I hope you guys get to hear more from him. The other person who will be co-teaching this class is Dr. William Koehler, another extraordinary dynamic teacher who is currently the Dean of the School of Business and Communication at Regis College. We are also very fortunate for him to have agreed to co-teach this course with Dr. O'Connell, and Dr. Koehler is teaching or contributing to another such course which just recently got written up by the Boston Herald. So if you guys type in pandemics and globalization and Boston Herald, you can see a little more of the first avatar of this course. Apart from being the dean, Dr. Koehler has also been the dean of the Bay State College for the School of Management, and before that at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, where he was the graduate program director. He has won several $1 million in grants where he has championed the collaboration and connection of transatlantic and interdisciplinary education among his many other things that he has done in his private life from a business point of view. So without further ado, I want to welcome you all and thank you all for being here. I'm really, really excited to hear more about this topic and particularly from our great speakers. So William and Jim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dutta Koehler. I'm going to start us off, Professor O'Connell, if you don't mind, sir. Pass it off to you. We'll be team teaching the course you see on the screen there, Globalization, Pandemics, and Planning, running Thursdays, 6 to 8:45. I hope that's right. This fall, and very happy working with Jim on it. And it's a topic we've really dug our teeth into, as it were, since we started researching this back in, when, Jim? March?
Yeah, spring. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Who's it here?
So thank you all so much for joining us. We want to give you an overview of the role of pandemics in history, look at how pandemics can be affected by planning measures, and understand the role of globalization and the growth of cities in pandemics, both past and future. So the image you see there is what's often been referred to as St. Vitus's dance. This is a disease that people thought was lunacy or religious madness, consisting of wild, uncontrolled movements and speech. Turns out it was a fairly widespread epidemic of Sydenham's chorea. This is an image of a cholera response to a cholera outbreak in London in the 1860s. There you have views of the 1918 flu pandemic that I'm sure we've all been hearing a lot about recently. And most unfortunately and most recently, signs of a mass burial of COVID-19 victims in New York City in April. Clearly, this pandemic has changed our lives like none before for those of us who are under the age of 102. But it's important to realize that this is a fundamental part of human history and understand how we can learn from past pandemics as well. There are our names and contact information should you want to get in touch with us. No charge for that, folks. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about cities, right? Cities are not new. Of course, we've had cities. Human civilization has had cities for 10,000 years. But what is new is how many people live in them. For years, cities were places where people went to die. Cities had very high mortality rates, high rates of disease. And so for many, many years, cities could only thrive through what we call city replenishment. Quote here from Thomas Jefferson, maybe a little out of favor in these times, but gives us a glimpse into thinking at the time. Talking about a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia in 1800. I hope the yellow fever will discourage the growth of great cities in our nation. And I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. Harsh stuff for us urban planner folks, isn't it? Typhoid, recurring disease throughout cities for several hundred years, only recently under control in the developed world. So what is it about cities? Well, they depended on rural influx, right? Remember, until 1960, 2/3 of the world's residents lived in rural areas, usually in farming communities, right? It's only very recently in the entire scope of human history that the majority of the globe's residents, now about 55%, have ever lived in cities. At the time Thomas Jefferson was writing, about 95% of people lived on farms and lived via agriculture. Cities cut off from the source of food oftentimes, produced a lot of malnutrition. And of course, this is in the time before modern sanitation, cities were dirty. Sewage running raw, free dumping into rivers, all of this created a widespread mortality for city dwellers. What were the worst diseases? Bubonic plague and smallpox, two biggest killers in human history that way, along with malaria. But you also have diseases such as typhus, cholera, measles, tuberculosis, all of which needed the density of cities and the density of human waste in cities to spread. So I want to turn this back over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim O'Connell.
Okay, do you want to put up the whole slide?
Sure.
So that I know what I'm looking at. Okay, great.
Beautiful.
The last 3 years, I've been teaching a course in this program on global cities, looking at Boston as a case study. So in this past spring term, we're in the middle of the class, and then of course, the pandemic hits and throws everything off. And so many of the suppositions and theories around globalization and global cities that I have been discussing over 3 years are kind of all of a sudden, not going to say thrown out the window, but definitely brought into question, and definitely a lot of those trends are going to change. They are changing. So it's kind of really quite amazing. Nevertheless, globalization is here to stay. Some people might think that we can turn it back at the borders, but as long as we have the internet, we have air travel, we have global supply chains, multinational corporations operating in multinational markets, we're going to have globalization. So we're going to be looking at those issues and how those are changing or playing out as we go forward from 2020. You could see here some of the other issues that are related, certainly immigration, the cultural exchange, and how those things are changing. We are having tensing up of relations, for instance, with China, and China's becoming more controlling, and we will be getting into a number of these issues. So that's kind of setting the table on globalization. It's a lot of fun to study. Back to you.
Why, thank you, my friend. Want to give you a sense of the scope of some past pandemics here, but also want to get across the message that it's part of human culture as well. This is an image of Shitala, who is the Indian goddess of smallpox, who, according to legend, would infect followers who are not sufficiently devout with smallpox. Good way to boost your temple attendance, I guess. The second image there is Saint Nicasius of Rheims. That's the Catholic patron saint of smallpox sufferers from the 5th century. I like this one particularly. This is Shapona, who is the Yoruba god of smallpox. You can tell by the white and blue splotches what he's supposed to represent there. These images are just designed to give you a sense that infectious disease has been a fundamental part of human history for at least the past 8,000 years, deeply embedded in our culture. How we respond to it, and this is something that Dr. O'Connell and I will explore in length in the course, is a very different matter. Now, what do pandemics bring? Well, obviously, disease brings death. We know that. It also, though, brings huge population movements. People flee cities during times of pandemic. It's happened throughout human history. We see it even in the case of New York City and COVID, where wealthy New Yorkers fled to rural, uninfected areas. Now, you've probably heard a lot these days about herd immunity with regard to COVID-19, right? That's the idea that when sufficient numbers of people been exposed to a disease and survived it, then they carry a certain immunity. And when you get to a certain population percentage, usually around 70%, that's when society can move forward again a little more safely, right? By the best estimates, we're probably in the 10 to 15% range in the US right now. So to get to herd immunity without a vaccine, we're probably looking at another 1.5 million to 2 million deaths, according to the latest estimates. Clearly unacceptable. What we don't often think about, though, with pandemics is the role they have in shaping the course of history. This is something I find fascinating. 50 to 100 million people, estimates vary of course, died in what's called the Black Death, bubonic plague, in the 14th century. Everywhere from China to the Middle East to Europe, completely struck by it. That event, however, was part of the impetus for the start of the Italian Renaissance. The Christian Reformation of Martin Luther created Protestant religion in the world today among Christianity. Again, a direct result of the depopulation and loss of belief that come about through the pandemic. Empires have also fallen. The great empire of Genghis Khan, probably the largest empire ever in the history of human civilization, stretched from China and Korea to Poland and Turkey, almost all of Eurasia. Wiped out pretty much in a generation by the Black Death. Lots of great societies as well in the Americas. The Aztec civilization, estimated at about 15 million in 1500 total population, reduced by about 90% over the next 50 years once smallpox and measles were introduced. Lots of impacts from pandemics outside of the health impacts that we often think of. Globalization, though, is the key to it all. Pandemics do not happen without globalization. So let's explore that. Happens through trade, right? Trade is a fundamental concept of our global economy, and it has been for thousands of years. Pictured here is Marco Polo. Many of you may be familiar with him. Traveled throughout most of Asia in the late 1200s, actually served as the lead diplomat, the Secretary of State, if you will, for Kublai Khan, whom you may know from Xanadu fame. Trade is one of the key drivers, however, of pandemic infection, because that's where you move populations across long distances. Sailors throughout history have been some of the greatest vectors of disease. War, of course, huge spreader of pandemics through globalization. That's Genghis Khan, whom we were discussing a little bit earlier, a rather ruthless fellow. His armies brought plague from China to Europe and the Middle East in the early 1200s. Resurfaced again in the 1300s in a much more devastating way. But his empire was cut to shreds by the spread of bubonic plague among his peoples. Interesting side note, this is the historian in me, one tactic that Genghis Khan used in his expansion of his empire was to take diseased bodies with plague or smallpox and catapult them into his enemies' positions and into cities that were resisting him. So not the nicest guy in history. A third way that disease spreads, again related to globalization, population movements. This can be simple immigration. It can be mass migration for environmental reasons, or as in the photo here, because of war. These are Belgian refugees fleeing German troops in World War I, and likely carrying influenza, the 1918 pandemic, along with them. And finally, of course, exploration and colonization is a huge spreader of disease. Why? Because it brings groups of people together who don't share the same immunities. We saw that with the Aztec and Incan civilizations being essentially wiped out by smallpox in the 1500s, right? Now, a specific example, and this is where planners get to be the heroes, a specific example of how planners can combat pandemics and disease comes to us from London in the 1850s. So this fellow, John Snow, not nearly as dapper and charming as his current namesake, I guess, but he was a physician in London. And again, medical science was not terribly advanced 150 years ago, as you probably would guess. But he did realize that all of the cholera cases in a certain neighborhood came from people who used a certain well. So his great solution to the cholera problem was to simply take the pump handle off of that well so no one could use it. He gets a lot of credit for helping address cholera, but didn't really do that much. The fellow whom we want to talk about, we'll talk about him in a second, is the one who helped solve the Great Stink of 1858. And is there a better name for a disease outbreak than the Great Stink? Cholera, as you may know, comes from contaminated water, usually with sewage. So London, of course, in 1858 did not have a sewer system. So this gentleman, Joseph Bazalgette, who was the chief engineer for the public works for the city of London, fought for the next 7 years to get one built. After that, cholera cases in London dropped by over 80%. Planners to the rescue. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to my good friend, Dr. Jim O'Connell.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got the term here, planning. We're going to be talking about planning and what we do in the midst of the pandemic and going forward. And I'd like to argue that I've got a couple perspectives on planning. One is you've got the formal planning that's done by cities, states, zoning plans, infrastructure plans, et cetera. But then you have, you can't call it, maybe it is planning by individuals, by businesses, by institutions, where people are making decisions. Am I going to work from home? Will the company that I work for encourage people to come back to the main offices in the city? How will they structure that? Or how much will they encourage people to work online? So it's kind of, you've got these lots of individual decisions, but are working within certain paradigms. So it isn't, sometimes it's under a plan, and a government-sponsored initiative. And lots of times it's just, you know, kind of people figuring out in their culture what their choices are and how they operate. So I always like to kind of put that out there as a planner, because if you look at this, you'll look at government coordination, and certainly, you know, we have had that in Massachusetts in this pandemic. But zoning is a thing, certainly it's up to the municipality to do the zoning, but then it does it within a framework created by the state. And then the actual development of buildings or housing or whatever is done by developers, and then, you know, occupied by people who make an individual decision. Am I going to move out from the city to a suburban home in Woburn or Winchester, wherever? So it's kind of, I always like to look at these individual decisions, because so much of what's happening now is going to be how people respond to being in cities and dealing with this pandemic. And then, you know, sometimes it's in a building code what the building design will be, and sometimes it's really up to the builder and the developer. And then supply chains, which I think is going to be a lot of fun to get into in this course, particularly in terms of the medical, biotech, pharmaceuticals, and how vaccines are being developed. And that's something which I've been really personally interested in recent months, have been researching. I'm not an expert on it. I know nothing or have known nothing about the business of supply chains, and I certainly haven't understood the biology, but I've been working assiduously, and I hope in this course to be able to take people along in understanding how that works globally. It's quite a story, if you'll recall back to the masks, how we didn't have enough masks back in the spring, and Bob Kraft had to take a plane over the Patriots plane to pick up 1 million masks. Well, what kind of supply chain is that? So we'll be looking at things like that. Next slide. Okay, here we are, global supply chain. Where are the pharmaceuticals being made? Here, China, how self-sufficient are we? And they're very complex, these supply chains, and people should know how they work. It's very interesting to discover. So next slide. Okay, so this is the big question, which people were asking back in the spring. After what, post-COVID, what's the future of cities? And William pointed this out. Are people going to be moving out of cities? Certainly, I think certain people are, and there will be some lessening for the time being, just because cities are expensive and there are lots of costs, even besides the cost of rentals, to being in cities. Just think, people have to commute a couple hours every day. Geez, if all of a sudden you can work at home, you can have 2 more hours to yourself instead of spending it on Route 128 or the Mass Pike. Oh boy, that doesn't sound too bad. So, what's going to happen to office space? Downtown Boston, there's been an office building boom in Boston. Are we going to use that? Are we going to need that space? Retail, what's going to happen to retail, restaurants, entertainment, culture? Housing is not going to be as shocked by that, but, is this going to drive, let's say, more housing in suburbia? We'll see. Higher education, if there's an institution or a sector that's going to be affected by it, it's higher education. And we're happy to be talking to students about how that's going to play out. Then the whole idea of transportation and urban greening, pedestrian zones. I heard, I think in some Asian city, they were saying, well, it would cost us X billion to extend a subway line, one subway line. But for a few $100 million, we could complete a whole regional bike and walkway system. So what kind of investment is that? So, Boston has the opportunity to do that. Will we do that? We'll find out. Next slide. And then we aren't going to just talk about public health. This is a great opportunity to talk about things like climate change. I think anybody who's been thinking is going to say, ooh, the disruptions that can take place from these natural forces that are beyond the control of humans, extreme weather, and then terrorism, which was a big question 15, 20 years ago, and I think still lies out there, power failures. A term in planning in recent years has been resilience, planning for resiliency. And sometimes people say, that's a cliche, what does that mean? Well, I think that with this COVID-19, it's really brought home the issue, how do we make our cities more resilient? Because these crises are going to be coming at us so that we can be ready for the next one. So that's something we're going to be talking about. And I want to say that, Williams pointed out that, he and I have really been into this topic. I think a lot of thinking people have been paying real attention since all this year and what's been happening. And, we aren't nobody's an expert on this. We're learning as we go along, and we're looking for students who really want to figure this out, to get a handle on these issues now in real time. So that's what I hope we're looking for. And students can take their topics in various directions. We're not going to say, oh, you have to just study this. We're just opening up the options. And the next slide. And just one more thing, how Boston is a case study. I think we all realize that this is a cutting edge city. It is a global city. It has had a kind of a golden age, and is it going to kind of be curtailed now? I don't know. We have had a state government, which I think has done one of the better jobs in this country in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So we should be looking at the lessons that have been learned here. As I said, there's a vulnerability in our business and institutional communities, and we're going to see how that plays out. And it's a great place to study it. With the global biotech center of the world, this great medical center. And it's really interesting to know how that works for us. Certainly, I think as a metropolitan area, we should see how can we maintain this edge. We certainly don't want to lose it, but to see the role that we play in the global economy. And then a lot of people might realize we have a high level of socioeconomic inequality in Boston, greater Boston, and we'll be taking that very seriously and really looking throughout if the socioeconomic, racial divides that there are in these communities and how they have been highlighted by this pandemic and what we could do about it going forward. I think people realizing these gaps more, and this is a great opportunity to do that. So I think that's my slide.
Thank you, Jim. Great stuff, my friend. Great stuff. So, as you've all heard before, but now you get to see again, this is the course that Dr. O'Connell and I will be teaching this fall. We'd love to see you in the class to help us with that exploration, as he discussed, right? And we'd like to open it up to questions to the audience or comments.
And I just wanted to say that if you just want to attend one lecture from the course or learn a little more about the topic, we would be so happy to share the syllabus of this course with you, and then with special permission for special lectures, maybe if you want to join this class, that's fine too, because we really want this to be an inclusive learning community where we learn and understand from each other, and knowing that interested people are connecting to the right courses and the right types of learning is very, very important for us, whether you take it for credit or not. So I just wanted to say that. Without further ado, Andrea, do you want to field the questions? Thank you so much. Jim, thank you so much, William. This is really fascinating. Even I learned so much about the history of pandemics and how these things happen. And certainly I know about the cholera in London, but I did not know it was called the Great Stink. So my bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koehler, and thank you, Dr. O'Connell. Yes, if anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat below, or if you want to use the raised hand feature on Zoom, you're welcome to do that as well. And it looks like we have our first question here from Matt. He says, in your opinion, professors, do you believe that there will be a, oh my goodness, Baselgate situation for COVID-19 that will help reduce spreading in cities? He revolutionized sewage.
Mm-hmm.
Quite the legacy for our friend Joseph Bazalgette. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're probably, and I'll defer to Dr. O'Connell after on this, I think we're looking at not one individual, but a type of individual who's been on the front lines fighting this. So that includes your Anthony Fauci's, but it also includes your vaccine researchers. It includes your political leaders who have stepped up, you know, as Jim talked about earlier, right? Our own governor, Charlie Baker, one of the best responses. Governor Cuomo of New York has also received a lot of accolades for his response. So I think it's going to be not one silver bullet a la Bazalgette, but more a silver shotgun, as it were, a bunch of people doing the right things and the collective actions thereof help us get past this.
I agree with that. Good point. I think one of the things that's going to happen, let's say we do get a vaccine sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, and some people will say, okay, you know, we're all set and they'll all be in the locker rooms cheering, oh, we won the ball game. But I think anybody who's paying any attention here, you know, there's going to be no cheering the end of the ball game. The ball game is going to continue. And I think that you're right. A team of types of talents, as you're talking about, is going to be really working on this going forward and saying, these are things which we have to kind of really wire into our communities, not just the cities, but the suburbs and rural areas as well.
Excellent question,
great.
Matt. Thank you.
And a good thing for students of the BU to kind of maybe get into that field.
Looks like Matt has a follow-up question. Matt, do you wanna go ahead and follow up, ask Dr. Koehler and Dr. O'Connell your question?
Hi, yeah. So my question was more just, so I kind of learned a little bit about the cholera outbreak. Can you all hear me? Just want to make sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so I learned a little bit about the cholera outbreak in my bachelor's degree for environmental engineering. And one of the things that I really liked was just how Bazalgette kind of, like I said, revolutionized the sewage system. But to me, it seems now just that because of COVID-19 and how it is, you know, the transfer is not necessarily just through the water. It can be person to person, and it almost seems to be more contagious than cholera at times. I was just curious as to how you think this will affect people's interactions within cities themselves, and like how that might be affecting urban building and urban affairs in the future.
I'll let Jim take the first stab at this one, and then I'll follow.
Absolutely essential question. I listened in on last week the talk on transportation with Professors Fassel and Regan. And, you know, Regan's point was it could take a decade for public transit to recover, which I thought was really shocking. So that implies that people are going to be reluctant to take public transit for public health reasons, an absolutely critical issue, and something which we've really got to take a look at. To my mind, I think anybody in an urban studies program has to be really afraid and feeling very bad that cities, and working as we have in more recent years in cities, could be under threat. So it's an absolutely critical question, and really kind of an unknown at this point, especially since there are other potential viruses that could be out there with different qualities.
Yeah, I would just add to that we're going to see, from a commerce standpoint, hollowed out cities. The business closures have only just begun. And from an economic standpoint, it's going to take that kind of time to recover. And I think truth of the matter is we'll be wearing masks for the next 2 to 3 years at a minimum.
Great. Anybody else have a question you want to pose to Dr. O'Connell, Dr. Koehler? Anything about the course, or anything about just the history of pandemics, how this is going to play out in planning? As we see, we're getting a firsthand account of what's going on.
Well, what I would add in terms of what we're doing in the course is a real focus on the interactions of the three, if you look at it, the 3 words of the course, right? Globalization, pandemics, and planet. Where do they intersect, and how can we better understand what we as planners, as policymakers, or even as voters need to do in order to help us get past this, right? Past experience tells us tells us what works, right? Interestingly enough, in the 1918 flu pandemic, right, which was called the Spanish flu, as I'm sure many of you have heard, even though in all likelihood it started right in Boston. Killed estimated 50 million people worldwide. But even then, there were public debates about big public gatherings, about wearing masks, the same sort of nonsense that we've heard over the past 6 months happened during the greatest pandemic since, right, in 1918. But we have learned that yes, masks and social distancing, period, end of story, help slow down transmission. That's what 1918 taught us. That's when we finally got past it. Couple of interesting examples from that pandemic. Philadelphia and St. Louis, two somewhat similar cities. St. Louis, upon getting its first case, stopped all public gatherings, advised citizens to wear masks. Philadelphia, my hometown, did not do that. As a matter of fact, September 20-something that year, held a huge parade trying to sell war bonds. Remember, this was in the middle of World War I, right? So the differing impacts that Philadelphia and St. Louis experienced are directly tied to political measures, to planning measures, to public health measures. We know this. This is nothing new. But with new challenges and a new social organization that we have today, we're going to explore in the course what we as planners and thinkers can help put in place to limit the effects of this and to mitigate future pandemics. So we want to take a very future and action-oriented aspect to the course here. And so for the final project, students will design a planning intervention designed to help either with pandemics or with disaster planning.
Very good, very nice. I believe Christian Casanueva, he had a question, he had his hand raised. Christian, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the lecture.
Hello, Christian. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? Just one line.
Okay. Well, my question is pretty much, you try to develop a theory that the necessary condition to have a pandemic is globalization. And we were talking about the consequence about transportation, housing costs, and all the stuff that pretty much Terry developed with Josh last week. So do you see any kind of new, talking about the globalization, probably a question more for Jim, a new kind of pattern that could happen in the governments in terms of protectionism, borders, a new wave, or how the economy will be develop and stuff like that?
We definitely have to study that. It's unclear right now what is emerging at all. And we'll be, let's say we look at various shutdowns, quarantine policies, Europe making it unwelcome for Americans to visit there now, and see how that plays out. Part of it's cultural, and part of it is pure public health strategy. So those are questions which are really unanswered right now, but certainly going forward, I think that would be a great topic for people to work on.
What I would add is that we're already seeing geopolitically a retrenchment from globalization and from globally oriented thinking. It's not just the US or other countries with bad leaders, it's the entire world, right? So we're seeing big pushes to make sure supply chains are as domestic as possible, so you don't have to have that exterior contact, right? We've had lots of countries, not just the US, withdraw from international cooperation agreements, such as the World Health Organization. So we're seeing a backlash to globalization that's at least in part pandemic related.
Great, very good. Looks like Matt has another question. He says, how do you think the November 3rd, 2020 election will affect COVID-19 and global urban affairs going into 2021?
Ooh, I love that question, Matt.
I don't know.
What I would say is that November 3rd matters nary a whit, but January 20th matters a whole lot. All right. So if come January 20th, we have someone in place who takes the pandemic seriously and listens to experts, then we're going to look like Germany. If not, we're going to look like Brazil on steroids. All right. So I think that's, I don't think there'll be much change just as course of the election itself. It's only when the new administration comes to power that we'll start to see, shall we say, reasonably intelligent action on the pandemic.
Well, you know, that's one thing that this pandemic has pointed out, certainly in this country. It's been based on reactions in states and cities. And, you know, obviously individual hospitals that have really been, you know, basically doing all the work. So, you know, it shows you the development of those entities for policy making.
I just wanted to add, first of all, thank you both so much. I know we can sort of keep at it, and I'm sure that this is going to be a discourse that is going to go on for a really long time. One thing I think that emerges from all of this, as has emerged in other times when crises have opened up, because it kind of lays to focus what is needed. One thing that has become very, very important and important particularly in the context of us being planning students, teachers, learners, enthusiasts, and so on, is that no amount of scientific knowledge, no amount of health care, technology, none of this is going to matter unless we are able to align the social, political, and the economic pieces all together. So as planners, I think our sort of space is to connect this scientific domain of knowledge with the social, economic, socio-political aspects so that we can actually plan and implement the things that we know work. And I think that's where our contribution is essential, because we have this interdisciplinary anchor, if you will, within the way we study. So I just wanted to, it's not a question, but a comment. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I would add that this pandemic has shown us firsthand how important community education is.
Absolutely.
Part of the reason that places like New York and Massachusetts are better able to open up than Florida, Texas, Louisiana, et cetera, is because we complied far more with mask wearing, with shutdown orders, et cetera, right? And that's a function of trust in the local government. It's also a cultural trust in science, of course. But it shows us that planners and public health officials, and let's not forget, public health is really just part of planning, right?
They used to be one and the same profession. You know, it was, I believe, around that time when the London cholera happened that the medical profession separated from the planning profession. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, really, it was interchangeable.
Exactly. But public health officials and political officials need to play a communication role, and a clear and consistent one. And that played out in the 1918 influenza pandemic. It played out during the AIDS epidemic, and it also played out during Ebola. And where you had failures of communication or a lack of trust in authorities, particularly, for example, with Ebola in West Africa, then you had much wider spread than otherwise would have been the case.
I'd like to pick up on Madhu's point about how public health and planning were once kind of the same thing. If you look at the origins of zoning in this country over a century ago, it was basically to keep residences separate from noxious industrial plants, which had unlimited pollution back then, until all through even the 1960s. You know, they just dumped it in the river, you know, in Cleveland, the famous Cuyahoga River on fire, but that happened everywhere. So that had a real public health element back in the 19-teens when zoning was really created. So that's an example right there, and then it turned into a lot of other things, like exclusionary zoning.
Well, and one thing I'd like to emphasize is a thread running through the course, and Jim talked about this, is understanding how issues of social and economic and racial justice play out against the backdrop of a pandemic, and also play out within the concepts of planning and globalization. That's going to be a key thread that we'll come back to in our readings and our discussions.
I see some new faces in the audience, so we are a very inclusive group, and we love to hear diverse and insightful comments. So if anybody has any questions, comments, things for the future, things the course should look at, your own experience that is relevant in this sphere, speak now, please. Great. I think we'll end the session here then. Andrea, do you have some last words?
Thank you so much. That was great. It was great to see the history of pandemics and bridging it into planning. And thank you so much for your time. We know you gentlemen are very busy, and I just want to invite everybody to the next event in our series. It will be next Wednesday at 6 p.m. I believe that's August 19th. Dr. Sungu, she's going to be talking about cities and data. So if you want to join us again next Wednesday, we'll provide the link in the chat to—
what time is it, Andrea?
It's going to be from 6 to 7.
Great.
And yes, these recordings are being shared, and they are going to be on the website, and we'll have this here in the chat. So yes, so next Wednesday, 6 o'clock, cities and data. And then the following Wednesday at 6 o'clock, August 26th, is going to be about mega urbanization and sustainability in Africa. And Dr. Madhu Koehler and one of our alumni from the program, Koehler, he is going to be talking about that. So 2 more exciting events coming up in the series.
And just to let you know that Koehler is a lawyer as well as a planner. He currently is associated with the United Nations and is working on many progressive policies in Africa, particularly in his home country. So there's real wealth of information to be shared about the state of urbanization in Africa and how that is contributing or not to a sustainable world. So, and that lecture is not going to be a lecture per se, but more a Q&A. So we would love for you to join, because believe it or not, what happens in Africa right now, or is happening, is very much going to affect us in the way our world shapes in the next century or so. But I can't stress enough that Dr. Sungu's Data and Cities, I am particularly excited and eager to see what new dimensions of thinking are being brought into this at this time. So great. Just my 2 bits.
Well, thank you so much all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed researching over the past 6 months. And we look forward to having you join our class. Please feel free to reach out to either Jim or me should you have questions, comments, or anything like that.